first things I try to help my students at Western Kentucky University realize is that they already have a system of philosophy. They already have a worldview. The problem is they're not conscious of it. They're not aware of it. Every time you and I make a serious judgment about some matter or other, our worldview is coming into play. Every time we judge that something is wrong, every time we make value judgments and we say that this is more important than this, let's say, our philosophical system, our worldview, is coming into play. Now, we're not only going to be studying Christianity and the philosophical worldview that constitutes the Christian faith, we're also going to be relating the Christian faith to some of the major thinkers in the history of Western philosophy. Christianity has some things it can learn from Plato. Plato had some things he could learn from Christianity. As Christians through the centuries have tried to develop and systematize the Christian worldview, they have often found it helpful to take advantage of what previous non-Christian thinkers did by way of philosophizing about the world. St. Augustine, for example, is one of the greatest of all Christian thinkers. Before the course is over, you'll be reading St. Augustine's Confessions. One of the things you'll learn from reading Augustine's own account of his life is how he was helped to come to Christ through his study of pagan philosophy. You will learn that Augustine wandered in the wastelands of sin and cultic religion for 12 years, the years between 18 and 30, rejecting the Christian faith of his mother, until it was his study of Plato and some other Platonists, a man named Plotinus among others, that helped break down some of the intellectual obstacles that stood between him and the Christian faith. Now, by studying the history of philosophy, as we're going to do this semester, you have an added advantage of breaking into the study of philosophy in its simplest form. Some fairly modern philosophers can be fairly intimidating. Kant, for example, who lived about the time that the American Constitution was being written, Immanuel Kant, or George Hegel, or Kierkegaard, or Nietzsche. It can be very difficult and intimidating to pick up some of these works and try to understand these individuals' thought. But what's helpful, and here our textbook, Gordon Clark's Thales to Dewey, can be very helpful. Gordon Clark says that by going back to the beginning of the history of philosophy, you can watch some of these ideas and some of these systems develop in their simplest forms. For example, next week, we'll be looking at an early form of relativism associated with a Greek thinker named Protagoras. And we'll find how Plato developed a number of objections to Protagoras' relativism that are extremely relevant in the relativistic culture in which we live today. In fact, I'll try to point out to you that there are some arguments in Plato's attack upon the relativism of Protagoras that Christian workers may be able to use in their witnessing or in their ministry or in their preaching. You might not want to admit to your congregation that this particular idea comes from Plato, unless you want to impress them. But maybe that would help, right? Maybe they haven't been getting too much from your sermons lately, and so suppose you just say next Sunday or some Sunday, let me tell you what I learned from Plato this week. Of course, they could also kick you out of the church, I suppose. I don't know. So we're going to be looking at a number of major thinkers in the history of philosophy with a view to seeing what we as Christians can learn from them that will help us better understand our faith. Now, we're not going to agree with everything that we hear this semester. I hope you don't agree with everything you hear this semester, because if you do, you will have forgotten the law of non-contradiction. We're going to hear a lot of conflicting ideas. Aristotle is going to disagree with Plato. The Stoics are going to disagree with the Epicureans. Aquinas is going to disagree with Augustine, and on it goes. Now, Gordon Clark, the author of one of our textbooks, says this shouldn't surprise us. In fact, Gordon Clark has as one of the purposes in his book the goal of showing us how often humanistic thinking, that is, human thinking that proceeds without access to God's special revelation, winds up at the end of a dead-end street. Well, let me identify for you the major thinkers that we're going to cover in the first part of the course. Let me give you a timeline Let this timeline start with the year 600 BC, which is the approximate starting point for the history of Western philosophy, and at this other end of our timeline, we'll just arbitrarily put down the year 1500 AD. Now remember, we still have some ways to, we still have another 500 years to go after we get to the Reformation, but this is the period of time that ought to occupy us for about 2/3 of the course. Now during this period of 2,100 years, there are really four major thinkers that we want to focus our attention on. Two of them are Christian, and two of them are pagan. Now the two pagan thinkers that deserve most of our attention will be Plato, whose dates are 427 to 347 BC, and his great pupil, Aristotle. Let's put Aristotle's name up here. And Aristotle's dates would be 384 to 322 BC. The other two major thinkers, numero uno, in this framework of 2,100 years, would be first of all St. Augustine, and his dates are 354 to 430 AD, and Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. Please notice the spelling of Aquinas' last name. There's no C in Aquinas. Maybe it's only students in my state of Kentucky that seem determined to put a C in there. Thomas Aquinas' dates are very easy. They're probably the easiest of these four dates to remember. 1225 to 1274 AD. In other words, if the fellow had lived just a few more months, we would have had this very easy sequence of 1225 to 1274. Incidentally, dates are not important in this course. The dates I give you are given only for some kind of temporal reference. I will never ask you a quiz question or an exam question in which dates become relevant. But certainly you will always remember from now on that Plato and Aristotle come before Aquinas and Aristotle. These are the big guys. Now, in addition to these four big thinkers, there are a number of second-rank thinkers. Some of them pretty good in their own right. So let me do I want to mess up this time chart now by mentioning some other thinkers? Well, there's a thinker who comes in here about 100 years before Augustine, who's very important. His name is Plotinus. Let's just put him down there for the fun of it. A pagan Roman whose thought nonetheless has made whose influence does show up now and then in the writings of certain Christian thinkers. Between Augustine and Aquinas, there's a very interesting fellow named Saint Anselm. How many of you have ever visited Canterbury Cathedral in England? A number of you. I'll drop the lectern so some of you can see. Anselm was Archbishop of Canterbury before the present great structure was built. but the great Anselm can be dated around 1100 A.D., and then there are some other systems of thought that we can, let's just put one other name up here. Let's put up in here, and I'm sorry this is getting so complicated, but let's just put up here the name Philo. Any of you know what Philo's religious background was? He's Jewish. In fact, Philo is really, he's not a great philosopher. Let's come right on and admit that. His writings are very confused and confusing, but nonetheless, built into that confusing set of writings that Philo left behind, there's some very interesting insights that we will have occasion to look at before very long. We don't know exactly when Philo died or was born, but we know that he did die around 50 A.D. That makes Philo a contemporary of Paul and Peter and Jesus, and we'll have to look a little bit later on at some possible suggestions that some of Philo's ideas may show up in the New Testament. I have some theories along that line. Well, there's one important name that I have not yet put on this board, and that's unfortunate, and we'd better do that. That's the name Socrates. Now, the tragic thing about Socrates is not only that he was executed in the year 399 B.C., but he never wrote anything, which I guess makes his fame and his importance in philosophy even that much more impressive. Here is a man who was known to us exclusively through 3 or 4 sources in his own time. Fortunately for us and for lots of other people, one of those writers that talked about Socrates was the great Plato. One of the problems that we'll talk about next week, one of the problems in understanding Plato's dialogues is trying to figure out when Plato is telling us the historical truth about Socrates and when Plato is simply using Socrates as a mouthpiece for some of his own ideas. Well, all of that is yet to come. What we want to do today is take a look at some of the more interesting people who appeared in the century and a half before Socrates. So let me erase this time chart, and let's begin to talk about the philosophers that we call the pre-Socratics. Pre-Socratic philosophy. Now keep this in mind. You're going to hear a lot of strange names. That may not be all that bad. Some of you, I know, are looking around for new names for the children that you expect to have. You know, James and Jeffrey and those names are so common. Just think, you might get some new ideas here. Incidentally, my wife and I were always disappointed we didn't have another boy because we were going to call him Bubba. But Bubba never came, and the world will never be blessed by the ministry of Bubba Nash. Now, some of you are going to tell me that that's your real name and that what I see on these rolls is something different. Gordon Clark begins his History of Philosophy book with an outrageous claim. He admits that there's as much humor built into it as anything else. Let's put this sentence on the board and think about it. Those of you who've read Clark, you know that he is pulling our legs a little bit. But here's what Clark says. The history of philosophy began on May 28, 585 BC, at 6:13 p.m. Greek Daylight Saving Time. I don't know about the Daylight Saving Time. From the perspective of someone who has written some books and has always wondered, you know, the hardest thing about writing a book sometimes is finding that first sentence. This is a great first sentence. This is a great introduction to the history of philosophy. Nobody else has ever noticed this or talked about it before. Now, how could anybody in his right mind date the beginning of philosophy this narrowly? And those of you who've read the book know the answer. Somebody in ancient Greece predicted an eclipse of the sun. And the reason why Clark can get so specific here is because we can go back and check the records, and we can know when that eclipse of the sun began in the area of the Aegean Sea. It began about 6 in the afternoon on May 28, 585 BC. Now, the name of the character who predicted this eclipse, and so far as we know, this is the first eclipse of the sun ever to be predicted. His name was Thales. An interesting character. A guy that lived an interesting life. On one occasion, he was walking along the landscape on one of the islands in the Aegean Sea, and he was looking at the stars, the constellations, and he fell in an open well. I mention that because a lot of people think that kind of behavior typifies what you should expect from a philosopher, right? He's so preoccupied with otherworldly things that he's totally inattentive to what's going on in front of him. But just to save Thales' reputation, Aristotle tells a different story about the guy. He was astute enough to recognize that the olive harvest on his island was going to be especially bountiful one year, and so he bought up all the olive presses, and he made a killing in the olive market. Now, I mention that second story to show you that those of us who are philosophers could turn our hands and our geniuses to making filthy lucre. But we're interested in higher things. I have never fallen in an open well in my life. I have never made a killing on the olive market. But I'm sure I could do at least one of those two things if I really set my mind to it. I'm going to draw a map of Western Asia Minor. It took me years to learn how to do this. I hope you watch my technique. Assume that is Western Asia Minor. Now, we all know that Asia Minor is somewhat like that, okay? And then here is Greece and so on, and here's the Aegean Sea. Greek philosophy did not begin on the Greek mainland. It didn't begin in Athens. It didn't begin in Sparta or Corinth. Get out a real map and look and see what it really looks like. Greek philosophy began in certain Greek colonies. And one of those Greek colonies was an area called Ionia. This would be, if this were a proper map of Western Asia Minor, it would be an area somewhere in southwestern Asia Minor. For that reason, the first philosophers are called the Ionians. See how sensible that is? Nothing tricky about that. Moreover, they were all located in a little Greek city-state in Ionia called Miletus. Miletus. Miletus no longer exists. I'm not even sure the ruins are there anymore. But for that reason, the first three Greek philosophers are also called the Milesians. They're called Ionians because of the general geographic territory. They're called Milesians because they all were citizens of the city-state called Miletus. These three individuals, and I guess I'll give you their names, were Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Perhaps I'll also give you dates for these people, and often these dates are only approximate, all right? We can never be sure that we're dealing with the precise dates for these people, but in the case of Thales, 624 to 546 BC, in the case of Anaximander, 610 to 547 BC, and in the case of Anaximenes, 585 to 528 BC. Again, the dates are not important. You don't have to remember them. They'll look good on your notes, and they'll only help you place these people into the history of into the general history of the times. 4 words summarize the basic position held by all 3 of these individuals. And with these words now, we as Christians can begin to interact and disagree with some of these people. You can sum up the worldview, the metaphysics. That's not one of the 4 words, but let me at least introduce that term. When we talk about a philosopher's metaphysics, we are talking about that philosopher's beliefs about ultimate reality. Now you say, I'm not sure I know what you mean by ultimate reality. Well, hang on for just a moment, and you'll quickly be in touch with Thales' view of ultimate reality, okay? So whenever we use the word metaphysics, your definition for that should be ultimate reality, beliefs about ultimate reality. Now, the metaphysical beliefs of these 3 thinkers can be summed up in these 4 words. Number 1, naturalism. I'm going to define each of these words in a moment. Materialism, monism, and finally, and here's the first really tricky word I think that we will expose you to today, Hylozoism. I don't know whether Shirley MacLaine is a Hylozoist, but we'll find out in a moment or two. First of all, what is naturalism? Well, here's the way I'm using it for our purposes. A naturalist is a person who tries to explain the world without any reference at all to a supernatural being. A naturalist is a person who thinks the world can be explained adequately and sufficiently without any reference to a supernatural being. Here's another aspect to the definition. A naturalist is a person who believes that this world is the only world that exists, that the natural order is the only thing that exists. Naturalism is still around. The Milesians have gone their way. They went on to their reward, such as it is. But our culture and our civilization is literally full of naturalists. Go over to the University of Central Florida or go to my campus in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and you can barely take a step without stepping on a naturalist. They're all over the place. The essence of naturalism is the belief that we don't need a God to explain the existence of anything. It's just there. It's a brute fact. One of the nice things about Gordon Clark's book is the way in which he keeps bringing home to you, the reader, the fact that these poor people, as esteemed as they are in the history of philosophy, these poor people were incapable of even conceiving of a God such as you find in Judaism and Christianity. Had some Jewish prophet visited this part of the world and told these people about Yahweh, it would have been the biggest news they'd ever heard. It was inconceivable to them that the physical world, the visible world, could have been the creation of a sovereign, all-powerful, immaterial God. So they were naturalists. This world is the only world that exists. They were also materialists. Now, you know what a materialist is. A person is a materialist who denies the existence of anything that isn't matter, that isn't physical, that isn't corporeal. Now, materialism has hardly disappeared. Again, the academic world of America, of the world, is dominated by materialists, people who want to tell you that you are nothing more than matter in motion, that you aren't a soul, that you aren't a person, that there's nothing immaterial or incorporeal about you. Now, again, we have to feel sorry intellectually for these people, because the very concept of an immaterial substance, the very existence of something that wasn't physical, isn't going to become apparent to the Greek mind until we get to Socrates and Plato. Maybe the Pythagoreans, but certainly the first person in the history of the Western world to actually sit down and write about the existence of a non-material reality is Plato, in his view of the soul. That's the first time. For these people, everything, the air, a human consciousness, everything is matter in motion. Thirdly, they were monists. Now, a monist is a person who believes that the ultimate explanation for reality is one single thing: monism. A little bit later on, we'll come across some people who believe that reality is ultimately two things, or more than two things. Well, we have names for them. We call them dualists. A dualist is a person who tries to explain reality in terms of two basic things. And incidentally, Plato will be a very good example of a dualist. The key to my interpretation of Plato lies in several groups of pairs in Plato's system. One of them being soul versus body. But there are other dualistic pairs in Plato's philosophy. These people were all monists. They all believed that there was one basic stuff that explains or accounts for everything else that exists in reality. I'm going to come back to that in a second. The last big word, and you'll be surprised at how simple it is to define it, the last big word to describe these Milesians is the word Hylozoism. Now that comes from two Greek words. Let's see if there are any Greek students here who can... What's the Greek word Hule mean? Forget I asked the question, all right? But now watch how quick we get an answer here. What's the word Zoe mean? You can always tell when you're in a seminary and students know the meaning of Zoe. But Hule, I don't blame you for not. That may not even be a word in Koine Greek. Certainly a word in classical Greeks used it all the time. Hule is the Greek word for matter, the stuff of which things are made. Hule. Now, when you take the idea of matter and life and merge them, as we find in the case of Hylozoism, you get then the theory that matter is alive. Matter is alive. You see, at this time in the history of thought, these people had not yet come to recognize the difference between animate and inanimate things. And so when things changed in their world, they explained that change in terms of things being alive. For example, in the case of a magnet or a lodestone, which was the basic form of a magnet available in ancient Greece, the Greeks had recognized that certain rocks, a lodestone, has the power to attract iron. Now, the way in which they explained that power was simply this. They said, the magnet is alive, the lodestone is alive, the nail is alive. And so that was their way of explaining that particular phenomenon. It will not be until much later in the history of philosophy that we get a clear-cut difference between animate and inanimate matter. Now, one final comment about each of these three thinkers, and we will be through with them. Each of them taught that all of reality is simply an appearance of one basic stuff. The Greek word that they used to refer to this basic stuff is the word arche. Now, probably the easiest way to understand what arche refers to is to think of some of the English words that we build upon it. Arch, for example. In a building, an arch is an important point which supports a lot of the weight of that structure. So the idea of arche refers you to something that supports or stands under something. Archaeology has you digging below the surface of things, I suppose. Now, here's how these three Milesians explained the basic arche of the universe. For Thales, he said, everything is made of water. I once said that to the registrar at my state university. I said, Thales once said that water is the basic stuff. And he said, well, I can think of some liquids that would serve the purpose a little better than water. But you run into that sort of thing at a state university, I guess. Now, what could Thales possibly have meant? What he meant was this. Take anything in the world that you're aware of right now, this glass, this cup, this paper, this table. There is a common stuff that underlies all of these different things, without which none of them would exist. In a sense, what the Milesians were doing was not very different from what physicists do today when they tell you that underneath this hard surface of this hard table, there is really something more basic, energy, fields of force. And when some of us try and, visualize or conceptualize this subatomic physics of today, our minds go a little bit blank. But what I'm trying to help you see is that even though Thales' answer was silly and hardly worth remembering, his question was really very profound. Beneath all of the multiplicity and diversity of this complex world in which we live, is there any one thing that supports it, that holds it together, that makes its existence possible? And Thales' answer was water. Now, he didn't just pull this out of the air. There were several reasons why he picked water. One of the reasons was this. In that day and time, there were only 4 basic elements. And so anybody who was going to be a scientist in those days had to talk in terms of 4 basic elements, which happened to be water, earth, air, and fire. Those were the 4 basic elements that people thought about in those days. So what Thales did was this. He said, well, I got to pick one of these elements. Which one looks more basic? And he said water. Now his reasoning might have gone along these lines. He might have said, what happens to a human being when he no longer has water? He might have visited Saudi Arabia, for example. He said that being dies. What happens to a corpse after death? Well, it begins to dry out. Perhaps he noticed that water assumes the three basic forms. It can be a liquid, it can be a gas, it can be a solid. Perhaps he'd watched water turn into ice. Perhaps he'd watched water evaporate into steam, and he thought, oh my goodness, why can't this be the basic stuff? Because it can be liquid, solid, it can be air. Perhaps he'd been in a cave and he'd watched water dripping from the ceiling, which to him could have looked like stone turning into water. So as silly and inadequate as his answer is, he didn't just pull water out of a hat. He no doubt had some arguments that he could present for it. Now Anaximenes, on the other hand, he disagreed with Thales. He said the basic stuff, the single arche of the universe, is not water, it's air. Now, in one sense, that seems a little disappointing, because here we have a man who just pulls another one of these four basic elements out. Again, he could give reasoning to support his answer, no doubt. He could notice that when human beings are cut off from air, they die, that a corpse doesn't breathe, that air is basic to life. But people have pointed out that as disappointing as Anaximenes' appeal to air is, as the basic stuff of the universe, he did mark an advance over his predecessors, because he also came up with a principle of change. He came up with a principle of change, namely condensation and rarefaction. Condensation and rarefaction. Again, nothing worth remembering, very primitive. But remember, we're at the beginning of science. These people were not only the first philosophers, they were also the first physicists. And so here is a man who says, here is the basic stuff of which the world is made, but then here is the process by which this stuff changes into the many things that we find in the world. As air becomes thicker, it turns into earth. As air becomes thinner, it turns into clouds and then fire and then water and so on. The really interesting guy among the Milesians, however, is really the middle one, Anaximander. He really is the most advanced of these people, and I have to be careful to restrain my enthusiasm here, because I could easily spend far too much time on Anaximander. Let me just tell you what the basic stuff was for him. And I'll give you the Greek word, since we're all becoming acclimated to the Greek language. Anaximander called the basic stuff of the universe the apeiron. Now you know that a is the Greek prefix of negation. Peiron was the Greek word that meant fence or boundary or limit. If you and I were Greek farmers and we were disagreeing about where the boundaries between our two farms lay, we'd go out and I'd say to you, well, I've just had the land surveyed, and this is the peiron right here. This is the boundary. On this side of the line is my land, on that side of the line is your land. Well, Anaximander took this word and this idea, peiron, and he said the basic stuff of the universe is the apeiron, usually translated as the boundless. And here's what he meant. He said, there's something primitive and naive about identifying the basic stuff of the universe with water or earth or air or fire. None of those can be the basic stuff. Therefore, whatever the one single arche of the universe is, it must be something more basic than earth, air, fire, or water. It must be totally different from them. And so he called it the apeiron. What he meant by that was, I think, something like this. The basic stuff of the universe has no identifiable features or properties or characteristics at all. It isn't hot or cold. It isn't wet or dry. It isn't up or down. It isn't anything at all. It has no distinguishable properties whatsoever. It is neither this nor that. It is neither here nor there. It is an unknowable X. Now that may not ring your bell right now. That may not mean a whole lot to you. But before the history of philosophy is finished, a number of thinkers are going to maintain that the basic stuff of the universe is that same kind of indefinite, structureless, propertyless X. Aristotle, for example, will talk about something called primary matter. Aristotle's doctrine of primary matter plays an important role in Roman Catholic teaching about the Mass. It plays an important role in the Roman Catholic understanding of the so-called miracle of transubstantiation. Perhaps if we have time, when I talk about Aristotle or Aquinas, I'll help you try and see that something very similar to this is operating at the basis, at the foundation of that thinking. John Locke, the British philosopher who supposedly had such an important influence on the American founding fathers, which is a claim subject to some debate, I think. John Locke believed that there is a kind of formless, shapeless, propertyless stuff that lies at the existence of everything else. Well, as I've said already today, you can live a rich, full, happy life and not know anything about Locke's propertyless substance or about Aristotle's primary matter. But if you ever do get interested in that stuff, Anaximanders seem to be heading in that direction. Now, there are lots of other things we could tell you about these people. Anaximander, for example, was the first man to develop a theory of evolution. When you look at some of the details of what Anaximander said, I'm always amazed that scholars give him some credit and overlook the much superior and much more ancient account of origins in the book of Genesis. But again, we can't do everything, so I just mention that in passing. Now, before we close the book forever on the Milesians, maybe I ought to just stop. I promised that you'd be able to understand everything that I said today. Is there anybody who has a question? And there's a question, yes.
I had a question on when you're on the naturalist, you said that they were incapable of conceiving or accepting God. Why are they incapable? Because there were no witnesses?
As Gordon Clark says a lot about this, it was just beyond their comprehension. Remember, we're dealing with human beings without any access to special revelation. They're trying to figure it out on their own. And one of the things Clark keeps beating home here is the fact that so often when human beings try to answer the most basic questions of life, they end up at the back of a dead-end street. Ask yourself this question. If you were alive in ancient Greece at this time, without access to any special revelation through Moses or through the Old Testament prophets, would your thinking have risen any higher than this? I guarantee you ours wouldn't have. These were the best minds of that time, and none of them, on their own, came to comprehend the idea of a sovereign creator God. Wait till we talk about Plato's view of creation. Plato's view of creation will mark a tremendous advance over anything that we see here, but even so, even the great Plato couldn't conceive of a spiritual God powerful enough, sovereign enough to bring everything else into existence. All right, the question was, by the mere fact that they gave all of this attention to the world, didn't the world then constitute their God? In a sense it did. Because a naturalist is a person who, if he is inclined to be semi-religious, can only look in one direction for his deity, and that is to nature. You're right. However, we've got to recognize that at this particular point, these people were, for the most part, irreligious. The basic religion of the time was the polytheism of the Greek, of the typical Greek, where there were supposedly these superhuman deities existing on Mount Olympus. None of these people were religious in the sense that they believed in those Greek gods. None of them were even religious enough to worship in some kind of pantheistic or nature-like way the universe. They simply stood in awe of this universe, of its law and its order, and that was as far as they got. Yes?
With an Anaximander in his view of an Alpeiron, wouldn't that go against a little bit the idea of the materialist, though? Because it seems like the Alpeiron would be some kind of stuff, but it's not material. So he wouldn't really fall into the category of material.
Well, but he did, because the Apeiron, I realize there's a kind of contradiction here. I told you that the Apeiron had no distinguishable properties. I cannot account for the apparent contradiction. It's not my contradiction, it's Anaximander's problem. Nonetheless, this stuff was conceived of as a kind of materialistic thing. He developed some pretty interesting theories as to how the Apeiron churned into or turned into the other elements, and you can read about them in Clark. But no, he was a materialist. Well, we must quickly move on, but yes.
I was a little confused about that as well. Is it that the materialism of this fellow, the second guy, was undefinable but still in existence in his mind, rather than the out-of-nothing creation? Christendom?
That's a good question. The four terms that I used are terms that we can take today and categorize these thinkers in terms of. They simply weren't conscious of any difference between living and non-living matter. They weren't conscious, it just hadn't occurred to them that there could be a difference between matter and spirit. All we can do is identify what was dominant in their thinking, and these are the key categories that we can use. Does that answer your question?
I'm still just struggling with this whole concept of, I don't know, is it ex nihilo, what the creation...
The Christian doctrine of creation?
The doctrine seems to me to be postulated always as, something out of nothing, and it seems as if there ought to be a distinction between Anaximander and this Christian doctrine of some sort.
Okay. I think if we get to Plato's view of creation next week, you'll quickly see the major point there. I don't think anything brings home to Christians the tremendous originality and creativity of the Christian view of creation any better than comparing it to Plato's view. So hold on until next week on that. Yes?
I'm still a little bit befuddled by the pre-Socratic inability to conceive of a theistic concept. Isn't it Paul who says in Romans 1 about the divine attributes of God being perceived through the created word? Why do they not have a God based on general revelation?
I don't see where Paul says anything in that chapter that implies that everybody sees God in nature. What Paul says is it's available, it's there, but plenty of human beings look at the same universe that you and I see, and they don't see God there at all. So I think we want to be careful as to how we read Paul's statement there in Romans chapter 1. Here, if for no other reason, here are good examples of the best thinkers that ancient Greece could produce at this time, and the concept of God, in spite of all of their study of nature and the constellations and the planets. The concept of God was totally foreign to them. Really was. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, you're saying that you keep calling it X or this other or whatever, but in relationship to rejecting the water, earth, and air, and fire, or does he call it another element like energy, or does he go further than just saying it's X?
When he calls it the apeiron, he means it has no color, no shape, no texture. It has no properties of any kind. And I think the best way to talk about something like that is to simply refer to it as an unknowable X.
So he's giving it an identity in rejecting the other elements that the others are using to describe the world.
Yes, but let's not impute too much to him. All right? It's very easy for us to look back and say, well, here, this may have been a very creative guy, and he may have been on the verge of a great scientific breakthrough. No. He simply said, I don't know what the basic stuff is, but it can't be any of the four basic elements. In fact, it can't be anything that has any properties, so... And we often find that. For example, if we have time today, we'll talk about another thinker named Anaxagoras, thank you, who talks about minds, the presence of mind in the universe. And Socrates got all excited when, as a young man, he found Anaxagoras teaching that. And then he realized that Anaxagoras had set forth an idea without fully appreciating the possibilities that that idea contained. It's not until you get to Plato and maybe Socrates that the idea of a divine mind controlling things in the universe appears for the first time. And one more question, and then we'll move on to our next thinker. Yeah.
I don't want to open the Pandora's box, but couldn't we understand their inability to conceive of a God in light of the depravity or noetic effect? That's sin.
I think that's the best Reformed answer for that problem. Whenever human thinking fails to touch base with God's truth, it's because of sin. It's because of our worshiping the creature rather than the Creator. So, and this is the basic theme of Gordon Clark's book. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at Thales or John Dewey, one of the big shots of 20th century philosophy. Their failure to grasp the truth about human nature and about God's relationship to the world is, in a sense, a function of the noetic effect of sin. And of course, in Dewey's case, it was also a result of his conscious repudiation of Christian theism. Dewey, unlike Thales, knew all about Christian theism and consciously repudiated it, consciously rejected it. Well, our next thinker. We don't have to go very far to move, and as soon as I finish this fellow, then we'll take our break. You don't have to move very far from Miletus to find our next thinker, because he lived in the city of Ephesus. Now that ought to ring a bell. This summer, my son, who's a computer programmer out in California, and he's also taking seminary courses out in California, he went on a journey to Asia Minor and visited Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamus, and all of those cities mentioned in the New Testament that are in Western Asia Minor. His slides of Ephesus are very impressive. Apparently there's some very remarkable reconstruction work being done in Ephesus. At this particular stage, you can see where the streets were laid out in Ephesus. The buildings aren't there. They're all knocked down, but oftentimes there are pillars and the foundations of buildings. And I gather there may be even some attempt on the part of people to reconstruct some of the buildings in Ephesus. Ephesus was 20 miles inland from Miletus. And this is where our next major pre-Socratic lived. His name was Heraclitus. A strange fellow. He's known as the Dark One for several reasons, one of which is the obscurity of many of his statements. We have many more fragments of Heraclitus' philosophy that have survived than we have anything from the Milesians. Please keep in mind that in every case, whatever these people may have written is long lost. And what we have to do is reconstruct their thought on the basis of quotations and allusions and commentaries and statements about these people in much later thinkers. Heraclitus seems to have been an obnoxious son of a gun. Everybody in Ephesus hated him, and he hated everybody in Ephesus. So that even though Ephesus was his home port, either for safety's sake or something else, he lived outside the community's limits. He's most famous for two teachings, actually. First of all, he's famous for his teaching that everything changes. He expressed that teaching in a famous quote, in a famous statement that's often quoted: "You can never step into the same river twice." Now let's imagine that you go down by the riverside, you take off your sandals, and you dip your pinky in the creek, all right? Well, during the time that you dip your foot and lift your foot and then step your foot back into the water, the molecules that have made up that water have changed. The river is flowing. It's constantly changing. You can never step into the same river twice. And this, for Heraclitus, symbolized his belief that everything is in a constant state of flux. Everything is in a constant state of change. Now, if we had more time, we could go into some of the details of Heraclitus's view of the changing nature of the world. But I'm much more interested in drawing your attention to this second important concept in his thought. Heraclitus is the first major thinker in history to make a systematic philosophic use of the Greek word logos. Now, over the next few weeks, I'm going to have a lot to say about the Greek word logos. As you know, it becomes a major name for Jesus Christ. John's Gospel tells us that in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. This word first becomes a systematic term in philosophy in the thought of Heraclitus. It will next become an important term in the history of philosophy for the Stoics, many of whom lived in the century before Christ. It also becomes a key philosophic term in the Jewish thinker Philo. So one of the questions that I address in my book, Christianity in the Hellenistic World, is this: does the presence of the word logos in the New Testament, does its use as a technical term evidence any influence at all from pagan Greek philosophy? And I give you some answers. I give you some theories about that particular problem. And we'll talk about them, I don't know, in 3 or 4 weeks. Now let's get straight, though, on what Heraclitus meant by the word logos. This is a common word in the Greek language. It has many meanings. Incidentally, the word is probably one of its lesser meanings. When the King James translators rendered logos in John 1 to mean word, they weren't picking the best word to use. But it is a legitimate translation of the word, but there are other meanings to the word logos. For example, it means law. Often when Greeks wanted to convey the idea of law, the Greek word they would use here is the word logos. Not only that, we get our word logic from logos. Now, I don't want to stress this too much. I think Gordon Clark, some of you may know, tended to place far too much emphasis upon this. But I think what we can at least get out of here is the notion that whatever else logos means, it carries with it the idea of reason. It can also be translated principle. Think of how many English words have a derivative of logos at their end. Psychology, suke logos, biology, the principled, rational, systematic, scientific study of life. All right? Pneumatology, how many theological words have logos at the end? Now here's what Heraclitus meant by logos. He seems to have meant by this word the very principle of change itself. Remember I told you that everything in the world changes for Heraclitus. It actually changes according to a very precise pattern. I won't go into the details. But for Heraclitus, the word logos seems to have been his way of referring to this cyclical nature of change that exists in the world. Therefore, he could say, and in fact he'd better say, that the logos is the one thing in the universe that doesn't change. You see, everything changes, he said, and then it occurred to him he'd better not take that too far. There has to be at least one thing in the world that doesn't change, that cannot change, and that is the law of change itself. Because if the logos itself changed, then his principle that everything changes would stop being true. Right? Now, this may not seem important to you now, but there's an important lesson to be learned here, and that is this. Nobody can ever be an unqualified relativist. No matter how inclined a person may be towards relativism and towards change, there's always got to be something that doesn't change. And we're going to see this principle of stability and non-change present in the future philosophers that we talk about.